Welcome to the Breaking the Guard podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about what to do when you get stuck. And one of the good things that I have found over the years is when you're not sure what you should be doing next, think about what you're afraid of doing. And that is usually a good indicator of what you need to be doing. Because now, if it's something like you're afraid of dogs or afraid of heights, maybe that's not what I mean, but more from like a work context or like a goal context. What are you procrastinating, right? Like, what are you trying to avoid having to do because you know it's going to be tough, it's going to be painful. Maybe it's a particular activity you don't enjoy doing, but you know it has to be done. That's usually the thing that you need to be doing right now, right? And we all have these in our life. We have things that we've been putting off, right? Because we're like, I don't want to get into that right now. I have a lot of other little things I can do to keep me busy instead of doing this thing. Especially when it comes to training, you'll find that the things that you're afraid of are usually the things that are going to benefit you a lot. For example, everybody's afraid of a hard conditioning workout, right? I've talked about doing, lactic capacity conditioning. And that is the one workout I really don't look forward to. That's probably the one I would want to delay and take a rain check on. But that's also the one that's going to give you the most benefit as far as being able to endure tough scrambles and whatnot, right? Who's the person maybe you're avoiding sparring, right? Maybe that's the guy that usually kicks your butt, but he's the one that can level you up, right? He's the one that exploits the weaknesses in your game, or that you have to step up to be able to defeat them. So, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. Any story that we ever watch becomes heroic when the hero has to conquer a fear, right? He has to go over something that he might be afraid of doing, but he knows he has to do. Kind of like the same type of line of thinking that doing the right thing is the thing you need to be doing, even though it has consequences, right? So it's in a similar spirit, I feel. So in your life, look through things, and I'll give you a few examples. For example, if we're talking about training, right? There are things that we need to think about in training. For example, where am I having the toughest battles, right? What position do I get beaten the most? What position do I not want to be in at any costs? Because that position that you fear the most is probably because that's your worst position. You know you're the most vulnerable. Perhaps you get tapped out there or you get TKO'd or whatever. So that fear is a position that you really want to be able to work on, right? So that's something that I would add into your game and start drilling it, start doing more, expose yourself to that weak point of your game more often. And this is not the first time I've said something like this, but I am, I guess, approaching it from a different angle as far as things that you might fear, right? So if there's a particular area in the fight game that you try to avoid at all costs, maybe make that something that you don't avoid, that in fact that you start from, right? Do situational drills or tell your partners to try to put you in that position so that you can expose that weakness of yours. And at a certain point, you won't fear it as much because you'll have more experience, you'll know how to handle it. So that's one type of way we could use fear to improve us. The other one is to use fear as a way of, as a tool for selecting workouts. What workout am I trying to avoid, right? What's the one workout I don't want to do? That's probably the one I should be doing, because if I'm afraid of it, it's probably because I suck at doing it, or I just know it's very tough and it's not going to be fun, and I don't want to get super tired or whatever. So that's the one I should be doing, because the more I engage in that activity, the better I'm going to be at handling it. I'm probably going to do it. The nature of conditioning workouts is they're never easy. because if you're doing especially something like a lactic capacity training, the whole point of it is to be dead exhausted at the end. So even when you get better at it, basically you increase the level of difficulty. So it's always going to be tough, right? However, there is improvement, right? Because you're going deeper every time. So maybe I did 2 rounds the first time I did it. Now I did 3 rounds, or then I did 4 rounds, right? And or the quality of the rounds are improving. So even though it's still tough every time, and maybe equally as tough every time, my output has increased. So that's a measurable improvement. So again, workout selection, being a masochist, right? Picking the things you don't want to do, those are good ways of using that, right? Another thing, like I said, sparring, I already mentioned. People who who are afraid of sparring, or maybe not, I mean, afraid might be a bit much, but maybe you're like, there's a guy in the room and you're like avoiding their gaze, right? You don't want to match eyes and they get locked into a round, right? If you have someone like that in your room, be proactive and just go up to them and take that round, right? Even though it might suck, even though you might get your butt kicked, right? You're going to learn something, right? And the more you can put yourself in those tough battles and come out alive, you're going to realize, okay, it might be bad, but it's not terrible, right? And, ultimately, hopefully we get better. At the very least, we're able to be competitive with somebody that we're not looking forward to battling. And maybe at a certain point you overcome them, right? And that would be a wonderful turnaround. So those are a few ways you can use fear in daily life. I feel like a lot of people procrastinate things, and that's just a way of expressing a fear, maybe not like in the traditional sense of being like, scared, right? But you just don't really want to do this particular assignment or task because it's tedious or it's difficult, and you rather just keep putting it off. So if you have something like that, tackle it, right? Just take the initiative, do it right now, and get it off your ledger, right? And if you're not aware of these things, then I would recommend that you make lists. I have lists. I've used lists for pretty much since I started competing when I was 14 or 15. And I would write down all the things I wanted to do, things I need to do, goals I had, all these types of things, right? So if you're writing down your list of tasks, like I use my phone now, they have like a to-do list, and every day I have things that I'm marking off what I need to do. So it happens on occasion with me, I'm not impervious to this either, where there's a task that keeps getting pushed, right? Like I say, okay, I was supposed to do this today, I tackled a bunch of other things, didn't get a chance to do it, it goes to the next day. And usually when that happens, that task might bounce 2, 3, 4, 5 times, right? Just because if you were able to bounce it once, that means in your mind you could probably bounce it 2, 3, 4 times. And not only that, if you were bouncing it once, it was probably because it was difficult or time consuming. So you're going to continue to do so. So if you're able to detect that and like, hey, you know what? I've postponed this same thing multiple times. Let's just freaking get it done. Even if it takes the whole day, let's just get it out of the way. Because personally, at least for me, maybe because I'm wired differently, but whenever I have something like that, that's like hanging on, it really drives me nuts. Because I'm like, I have almost like an anxiety, right? Because I'm like, man, why can't I get this thing done, right? It's just like, it's sticking around. So if you find those types of things that are like tasks or appointments or things that you keep putting off, make initiative to do it right now. Don't wait for like another, week or so. Tackle it as soon as you can and just try to get it off your list. And most commonly, at least from my experience, it's harder in your head than it is in reality, right? And if you're not sure how to tackle that particular task, you might have to break that task into its own items, its own list, right? Like, okay, what does that particular task entail? Write everything down. And in that way, what seemed like one task might actually be like 5. And then I could start doing the subtasks. And that's going to give you at least progress rather than just postponing it entirely. We're doing parts of this bigger task. And that's my advice, right? So we'll keep this podcast a little on the shorter side, right? And just stay on theme here, which is do the things that you're afraid of, right? Those are usually a good indicator of things that you need to work on. Now, I'm not talking about, and again, well, there is some insight into doing things you're afraid of, like conquering a fear of heights or claustrophobia or something like that, if it's something that is doable for you. Well, obviously, there are what I've called healthy fears, which is like you're afraid of, getting stabbed, right? I'm like, yeah, that's a good thing. You don't want to get stabbed, right? Or, you don't want to fall off a cliff or anything like that. But it shouldn't, I always feel like your fears should be reasonable, right? Don't have irrational fears where you can't explain to somebody why you're afraid of it, right? Or like how realistic that fear is, right? It's one thing, to be afraid of, let's say, flying in an airplane because the airplane could crash, right? It's possible, it has happened, but what's the probability of it? Very low. In fact, you're more likely to get into a car accident. So if you're driving in cars all the time, which most of us are, then having a fear of flying in a plane doesn't make that much sense, right? So that would be another thing as far as challenging fears that you may have and being sure that they do hold some water, right? Like if your fear is irrational where you would be embarrassed to tell somebody your fear or that no one else has that fear that you have, that would be something to question and think about it. Like, well, is this really a thing, right? Is this reasonable? Is this helping me or is this hurting me? If you had a fear of like air travel, for example, you would be limited as far as places you can go to, right? Because now you're going to have to drive across the country or, take a boat and go across the ocean, if you need to travel internationally. So it's definitely going to limit your life. So is it benefiting you or is it hurting you more? And, these are the type of things that you would have to ask yourself about a fear that you might have and be able to objectively look at it and think, what's really the problem here, right? And if there's a way to conquer that fear so that it's no longer an obstacle for you, right? And as an example of air travel, the way I would see it, again, I don't have a fear of air travel, but I can imagine what it would be like where you're when you're a passenger in an airplane, for example, you have no control. Right? There's nothing you can really do about it. And if something does go wrong and the plane crashes, you're pretty much toast. So for me, one, statistically, I feel very reassured that my chances are very low of having an incident. Second, the worst case scenario, I would die. In my case, I'm fine with that. I can live with that. Well, really, I can't. I would be dead. But I mean, it's not gonna. I know it's an eventuality, one way or the other. So it doesn't really affect me too much. And at least I can say, even at this point in my life, I'm very satisfied with the life I've led. So if it ended, at this very moment, so be it. Right? I've had a great life. I want more, of course. I don't want to die, but I can accept death is part of life, and if it happens to come by way of plane crash, so be it. There are worse ways to die, so a plane crash would be a relatively quick death once you hit the ground, I would imagine, versus being tortured to death or starving to death or something like that, which I would imagine would be far worse. So I have a few ways of being able to not be affected by that as much. So that would require, obviously not everybody's equipped like I am. I think most people are more afraid of death than I am. And I think that's something that everyone should be able to challenge, right? Because, of course, that's one of the biggest fears that people have is of dying, because we don't know what's really going to happen. We have ideas and theories, but no one really knows for sure. So obviously that could be a little bit more challenging, but if you can find a way to come to peace with that, it's definitely going to make those type of fears of, which are basically fears of death, transferred into some activity, a lot easier to deal with. Anyhow, I won't get too, into the weeds there. And I meant this more from a training, life goal type concept, but you can see you can apply this in a lot of ways. And again, if all that went over your head, the easy takeaway here is whatever you're afraid of doing in training, as far as being, getting beat in training, someone who's going to expose weaknesses of yours, or some type of conditioning workout that you don't like doing, seek those out first. Be proactive. Conquer those fears by forcing yourself to get into them early. And that's essentially going to empower you, because now rather than being forced to do something, you're doing it. You're forcing that thing onto you, right? So it's a little more empowering because you're taking the reins rather than somebody pushing you into the fire. So anyhow, hopefully that helps you guys, and I will see you all next week.